That morning, the city felt alive in the way only New York can. The streets hummed with life, and even the cool October breeze carried an energy that seemed almost contagious. I woke early as I often did, savoring the few moments of stillness before the day began. My life wasn't what it once was, but it was mine. It was something I'd rebuilt piece by piece after losing Michael, my first husband and the father of my son Alex. Michael had been my rock, my partner, my world. His absence was a void I learned to live with, though it never truly closed. Ethan came into my life years later, in a way that felt almost serendipitous. He wasn't Michael, nor did I expect him to be. Ethan was warm and steady, an engineer like Michael but so different in spirit. Where Michael had been thoughtful and measured, Ethan was endlessly optimistic, always charging ahead with a smile and a plan. And then there was Alex, my son, my constant reminder of Michael. Alex had grown into a man who mirrored so much of his father's confidence and intelligence, yet carried a quiet intensity all his own. At 33, he was a successful engineer, deeply driven and fiercely independent. I was proud of him, though in recent years, I couldn't ignore the subtle shift in our relationship. There was a distance between us that I couldn't quite bridge, something unspoken yet palpable. That weekend, I had asked Ethan and Alex to help with a project I'd taken on, a small apartment downtown that I wanted to restore. It wasn't just about the renovation. For me, it was a way to keep moving, to feel useful, to create something tangible out of the messiness of life. Ethan, as always, was eager to help, diving into the task with his usual enthusiasm. Alex, on the other hand, seemed reluctant. I wasn't sure if it was the project itself or something else that weighed on him, but he showed up nonetheless. The apartment was charming in its own way, with its tall windows and creaky floors. Dust hung in the air, catching the golden light streaming through the glass. The fireplace was the centerpiece of the living room, its old stonework a reminder of the building's age. It felt like a place that had stories to tell, though it needed a lot of work to shine again. We divided up tasks and got to work. The morning passed in a blur of scraping, sanding, and patching. Ethan took to it with his usual cheerfulness, while Alex remained quieter than usual, his focus more inward. There was something about his demeanor that unsettled me. Perhaps the way his gaze seemed to linger just a second too long, or how he moved through the space as if he were both present and distant at the same time. It was subtle at first, a shift so slight I might have dismissed it as my imagination. But as the hours wore on, I began to notice it more. The air between Alex and me felt different, charged in a way I couldn't explain. I told myself it was nothing, that I was overthinking things. That was until the latter incident. I had been working on the ceiling, smoothing over cracks with spackle, when I felt the ladder wobble beneath me. My first instinct was to call out for Ethan, but it was Alex who appeared instead. I didn't see him approach. I only realized he was there when his hand steadied the ladder, firm and sure. For a moment, I froze, aware of how close he was. I glanced down, catching his eyes, and something in his expression made my stomach tighten. There was no mistaking the intensity in his gaze, though he said nothing. I felt rooted to the spot, unsure of whether to climb down or continue working. I forced myself to focus on the task at hand, but the air around us seemed to grow heavier. When I finally stepped down, his hand brushed against my calf, just for a second, so fleeting it could have been accidental. But it wasn't. I felt it. I wanted to believe it was nothing, but my body betrayed me. A faint chill ran up my spine, the kind that comes when something forbidden crosses into the realm of possibility. Before I could think too much about it, Ethan came bounding into the room, his voice bright and cheerful, carrying the unmistakable smell of hot dogs. My shoulders ached from scrubbing the grimy window frames, but I pushed through the discomfort, wanting to see this project through. This apartment, old and worn, felt like a metaphor for parts of my own life. Restoring it had become something of a symbolic act. Ethan's cheerful voice occasionally filtered in from the kitchen. That was one of the things I loved about Ethan, his ability to see potential and possibility in everything, no matter how daunting. It was a quality Michael, my late husband, had shared, though the two men couldn't have been more different in other ways. Alex, on the other hand, was quieter, more methodical. He worked in near silence across the room, sanding the fireplace mantel. I tried not to glance at him too often, but it was difficult. His presence carried a weight I couldn't ignore, a mix of familiarity and something else, something heavier. It was strange, this tension that had grown between us. Alex had always been my son, my pride, my partner in navigating life after Michael's passing. But lately, there was a shift I couldn't quite understand. It wasn't just his age. Though seeing him at 33, so confident and self-assured, was a reminder of how time had slipped by. No, it was something else entirely. Something that left me unmoored. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself I was imagining things. Yet when Alex moved, I felt it. The pull of his presence, the way my focus zeroed in on him without my permission. His arms flexed as he worked, the muscles defined and lean. He looked so much like Michael at that age that it was almost painful. I scrubbed harder at the window frame, as if the act of cleaning could somehow scrub away my thoughts. But no matter how much I tried to focus on the task at hand, I couldn't shake the memory of what had happened earlier. The latter, the brush of his hand, it had been nothing, a fleeting touch as he steadied me. And yet, it had lingered in my mind like a forbidden song, its melody weaving through my thoughts. I could still feel the warmth of his fingers, the way they had hesitated for just a moment longer than necessary. I shook my head, trying to dispel the thoughts, but the tension in the air only seemed to grow. It wasn't until I turned to grab a cloth from the workbench that I realized how close Alex had come. He must have moved silently, because I hadn't heard him. Now, standing just a foot away, he loomed in my periphery, his presence commanding and unsettling all at once. I froze, my hand hovering over the cloth as my breath caught in my throat. For a moment, I considered stepping back, but my feet felt rooted to the floor. And then I turned. Alex was right there, his gaze steady and piercing. His eyes were the same shade of hazel as Michael's, but the intensity in them was entirely his own. My heart skipped a beat, the space between us charged with an energy I couldn't name but felt acutely. I should have said something, anything, to break the silence. Instead, I simply stood there, the weight of the moment pressing down on me like a physical force. Then he leaned in. It was slow, deliberate, and entirely unexpected. The space between us seemed to evaporate as his lips brushed against mine, so softly at first that it felt like a question. My mind screamed at me to pull away, to stop this before it could go any further. But my body betrayed me. Instead of retreating, I leaned into him, my hands trembling as they found their way to his shoulders. The kiss deepened, growing more insistent, more urgent, as if all the tension that had built between us over the past weeks was unraveling in this single, forbidden moment. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer, and I let him. For the first time in years, I felt alive, the kind of alive that wasn't tethered to grief or obligation. It was intoxicating, overwhelming, and terrifying all at once. The world around us seemed to fade, the apartment's peeling paint and worn floors dissolving into nothingness. All that existed was him, his touch, his warmth, his undeniable presence. But reality has a cruel way of intruding. The sound of Ethan's footsteps echoed from the kitchen, and the spell was broken. We pulled apart so quickly it was as if we had been burned. My hand flew to my mouth, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I turned away, pretending to fuss with the cleaning supplies on the workbench, anything to avoid meeting Alex's eyes. Ethan entered the room a moment later, his face alight with enthusiasm as he rattled off an idea about the cabinets. I forced a smile, nodding along as if nothing had happened. But my mind was racing, the guilt crashing over me like a wave. What had I done? The taste of Alex's kiss lingered on my lips, a reminder of the line I had crossed, and the fact that there was no undoing it. The evening descended like a slow exhale, the dim light from the windows fading into the soft glow of the table lamp Ethan had brought into the living room. He had left just moments ago, his usual cheerful energy lingering in the room like an echo. He was off to pick up some flowers for the small garden we had been working on behind the apartment, a project he had insisted we tackle together, his way of adding life to this old, neglected space. I sat on the couch, a glass of wine in hand, gazing at the flickering flames in the fireplace. The warmth of the fire cast dancing shadows on the walls, filling the room with a calm I didn't feel. My thoughts had been a whirlwind all day, and now, in the stillness of the evening, they settled into something heavier. Ethan's absence should have brought relief. Instead, it left an uneasy silence, the kind that magnified every stray thought and lingering emotion. I heard Alex before I saw him, the soft creak of the floorboards as he entered the room. I didn't turn immediately, unsure of what I might find in his expression. The memory of the kiss we had shared earlier lingered between us, unspoken but undeniable. "Fire looks nice," he said finally, his voice low and even. I nodded, not trusting myself to respond aloud. He moved closer, his presence filling the room in a way that made the air feel heavier, thicker. He didn't sit beside me at first. Instead, he hovered by the mantel, his gaze fixed on the flames. For a moment, it felt as though we were both lost in our own thoughts, the silence stretching out like a taut wire. But then he moved. It was subtle, deliberate. He crossed the room and settled beside me on the couch. The cushion dipped slightly under his weight, and the faint scent of sawdust clung to him, a reminder of the day's work. I told myself not to look at him. I told myself to focus on the fire, on my wine, on anything but the man sitting so close that I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. But I failed. When I turned to face him, I saw it. The same intensity in his eyes that had been there earlier. It was a look that left no room for misinterpretation, a look that seemed to strip away every layer of propriety and pretense. I should have said something to stop it, to diffuse whatever was happening between us, but the words caught in my throat, tangled up in the rush of emotions I couldn't quite name. And then he reached for me. It wasn't abrupt or forceful. It was slow, almost hesitant, as though he were giving me a chance to pull away. But I didn't. His hand brushed against my cheek, his thumb tracing a line along my jaw. The touch sent a shiver down my spine, a stark contrast to the warmth of the fire. And then he kissed me. This kiss was different from the first, less tentative, more certain. It was a kiss that spoke of everything we couldn't say aloud, a kiss that blurred the lines between right and wrong. I let myself sink into it, the world around us fading until all that remained was the heat of his lips against mine, the weight of his hand on my cheek. His other hand found its way to my waist, pulling me closer, and I didn't resist. The fire crackled softly in the background, its warmth a pale imitation of the heat building between us. I should have stopped it, but instead, I found myself leaning into him, my hands clutching at his shirt as though he were the only solid thing in a world that suddenly felt unsteady. The moment stretched, deepened, until it felt as though we had stepped out of time entirely. But then reality crept back in, sharp and unyielding. I pulled away first, my breath coming in shallow gasps as I put a hand to my chest, as though I could somehow steady the frantic beating of my heart. "We shouldn't." The words hung in the air unfinished, their weight almost unbearable. He didn't respond, but the look in his eyes was answer enough. I turned away, my hands trembling as I set my glass on the coffee table. The guilt was immediate and overwhelming, crashing over me in waves. The sound of the front door opening snapped me back to the present. Ethan was back, his voice cheerful as he called out to us from the hallway. I stood quickly, smoothing my shirt as though that could erase the evidence of what had just happened. Alex remained seated, his expression unreadable as he stared into the fire. Ethan walked into the room moments later, a bundle of flowers in hand and a smile on his face. I forced a smile of my own, hoping he wouldn't notice the tension that lingered like smoke in the air. But I could feel it, the shift in the dynamic, the unspoken truth that now hung between Alex and me. It was a truth that couldn't be undone, no matter how desperately I wished it could. I stared at the flames, hoping their warmth could reach deeper than my skin and burn away the growing knot of guilt and confusion in my chest. But the fire offered no comfort. It simply burned on, indifferent and unyielding, as if mocking my attempts to control the chaos of my own emotions. Alex's face lingered in my mind, unbidden but unavoidable. I could still see the way his eyes had searched mine earlier, filled with something that had felt like both longing and apology. And I could still feel his lips on mine, soft, hesitant at first, but then insistent, as though he were trying to convey something words could never express. I told myself it had been a mistake, a lapse in judgment born out of a moment of weakness. But the truth was far more complicated. Deep down, I knew it hadn't been entirely unwanted. That realization only made the weight of my guilt heavier, pressing down on me like a physical burden. The sound of footsteps pulled me from my thoughts. They were slow, deliberate, and unmistakably Alex's. My pulse quickened as the footsteps grew louder, each one a reminder of the tension that had been building between us all day. When he entered the room, I didn't look up. I couldn't. Instead, I kept my gaze fixed on the fire, hoping that if I ignored him, the intensity of his presence might somehow diminish. But it didn't. Alex stood silently for a moment, and I could feel his eyes on me, studying me with that same unspoken intensity that had been there all day. The air between us seemed to hum with an almost electric charge, the silence stretching out until it became unbearable. "I thought you'd gone to bed," I said finally, my voice quieter than I intended. "I couldn't sleep," he replied. His voice was low, almost cautious, as though he were testing the waters. I glanced at him then, and the look in his eyes stole the breath from my lungs. There was a vulnerability there, a quiet desperation that mirrored my own inner turmoil. He took a step closer, his movements slow and measured, as though he were afraid to startle me. I didn't move, didn't speak. I just sat there, frozen in place, as he closed the distance between us. When he stopped in front of me, he hesitated, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jeans. For a moment, it felt as though time itself had stopped, the world narrowing to just the two of us and the unspoken tension that filled the space between us. "I shouldn't be here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, though I didn't say anything. My throat felt too tight, my thoughts too tangled to form coherent words. And yet I didn't tell him to leave. He reached out then, his hand brushing against mine where it rested on the arm of the couch. The touch was featherlight, barely there, but it sent a jolt of electricity through me all the same. "I don't know what to do," he admitted, his voice breaking slightly. I looked up at him then, and the vulnerability in his eyes was almost too much to bear. There was no hiding from it, no denying the emotions that swirled between us, raw and unfiltered. Before I could think better of it, I reached for him, my hand trembling as it found his. His fingers closed around mine, and for a moment, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. "I don't either," I whispered, the words escaping before I could stop them. And then he was leaning down, his movements slow, as though giving me one last chance to pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. When his lips met mine, the rest of the world fell away. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as though he were testing the boundaries of what was allowed. But as the seconds stretched on, it deepened, the hesitation giving way to something more urgent, more desperate. I felt his hand slide up to cup my face, his touch both firm and gentle. My own hands found their way to his chest, clutching at the fabric of his shirt as though it were the only thing anchoring me to the ground. The fire crackled behind us, its warmth a faint echo of the heat building between us. Every nerve in my body seemed to come alive, the intensity of the moment overwhelming in its clarity. When we finally pulled apart, I was breathless, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. He looked down at me, his expression a mixture of longing and regret, and I knew he felt it too, the weight of what we'd just done. "I should go," he said, though his hands lingered on my face for a moment longer. I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. As he stepped back, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in, the weight of it settling over me like a heavy blanket. I watched as he turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the silence of the house. The fire burned on, its embers glowing faintly in the dim light, a reminder of the line we'd crossed, a line that could never be undone. The morning air felt thick, almost suffocating, as I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee, the steam curling up and disappearing into the stillness. The light filtering through the window was muted, as if the world itself had decided to mirror the heaviness inside me. Ethan's cheerful humming drifted in from the garden. He was working on the flower beds he'd been so excited about, completely oblivious to the turmoil that churned inside the house. I could feel Alex's presence before I even heard him step into the room. It was as though the atmosphere shifted when he entered, the tension wrapping around us like a fog. He moved quietly, deliberate in every motion, and though I didn't turn to look at him, I could sense his eyes on me. The silence between us wasn't new, but now it carried a weight that felt impossible to bear. I focused on my coffee, watching the ripples in the cup as my trembling hand betrayed the calm exterior I tried to project. Alex didn't sit at the table. Instead, He lingered near the counter, a deliberate distance between us, but it felt like an unspoken connection pulled taut. My thoughts circled endlessly, trying to make sense of how we had ended up here, at this impossible juncture where boundaries had blurred beyond recognition. The night before had been sleepless, haunted by flashes of what had transpired. The stolen moments, the intimate touches, the first kiss that shattered any pretense of control. My mind replayed the way his gaze lingered on me, the warmth of his hand brushing mine, and the overwhelming pull I had felt in that moment. It was a kiss that should never have happened, but now it was a part of me, lodged deep in my heart and refusing to let go. I tried to steady my breathing, to collect my thoughts, but they kept circling back to the same point. Ethan. His trust, his love, his unwavering belief in the stability of the life we'd built together. And yet, here I was, grappling with emotions I hadn't been prepared for, emotions that felt both exhilarating and suffocating. Alex moved closer, the subtle creak of the floorboards pulling me out of my spiraling thoughts. I could feel him, just a few steps behind me, and the pull toward him was undeniable. It wasn't just about the physical. It was something deeper, a connection that felt raw and inexplicable, and yet so profoundly wrong. I thought about Michael, my late husband, and the promises I had made to him to live a life filled with integrity and love. The grief of his loss still lingered, but now it was tangled with a guilt I could hardly bear. Had I betrayed not just Ethan, but Michael's memory as well? The memories of the previous day flashed vividly. The accidental touches, the brush of fingers, the tension in the air so thick it felt like it could snap. And then, that moment by the fireplace when everything shifted. I had felt his presence before I saw him, the way his eyes found mine in the dim light, his compliments laced with something deeper, something unspoken. It was in those quiet moments, when Ethan had stepped away, that the kiss had happened. His approach had been cautious but resolute, and I hadn't pulled away. I could still feel the weight of his lips on mine, the hesitation giving way to something deeper. The warmth, the softness, the way time seemed to stop in that instant. It had been both a surrender and a breaking point. Now, sitting in the kitchen, the guilt was unbearable. I thought of Ethan's kindness, his patience, and the trust he placed in me. He was the one who had brought stability back into my life, the one who had made me believe in the possibility of love again after Michael's death. And yet, here I was, silently betraying him in ways he couldn't begin to imagine. The lines between what was right and what was wrong had become so blurred, and I wasn't sure if I could ever untangle them. There was no denying the attraction I felt toward Alex, but it was overshadowed by the immense weight of what it meant. The boundaries we had crossed could not be undone, and the consequences of our actions felt inevitable. As Alex stood behind me, his presence both comforting and agonizing, I knew we had to confront what had happened. The kiss, the stolen moments, the unspoken feelings, all of it had to be addressed. But even as I resolved to bring it up, a part of me hesitated, terrified of what the truth would mean for all of us.